Hi, Brad. Welcome to the show. Welcome on board.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to see you again.
Thanks,
Great
Brad.
to be on here.
So let's get started with a quick, small introduction from your side, a baseball card kind of intro.
Yeah, absolutely. So, basically, I've been in the cybersecurity industry for just about 2 decades now, and I recently came over from Gartner, and while I was there, I covered ransomware, endpoint security, threat intelligence, digital risk protection, attack surface management, a whole laundry list of things. And now I do consulting with High Tide Advisors and my partners there, and help out organizations with their go-to-market strategies. And kind of taking the things that I've learned over the years and being able to apply it to more early stage companies, so ultimately they can help their clients and overall make the world a safer place.
Great, wonderful. So I do remember our conversation during your Gartner days, and it had always been very exciting. So one great thing about your role, which you had been playing in the industry for several decades, is that you got to see the industry from a very different lens and also from a very different breadth, the kind of breadth of coverage which you had in terms of talking to so many different organizations in various different sectors and verticals. That's something which is very interesting. So in that context, I mean, given what you had been seeing as the industry evolving over last couple of decades, we started off with those days when there was ethical hacking, which was absolutely manual. And then the industry went through this phase of evolution of automating network security testing in form of early days of port scanning and network VA, and then came application security testing. And now we are into a different kind of era of testing or security validation, whatever you might call it. So we have gone through a long journey as an industry, and despite all of this, we see a lot of these breaches happening, and sometimes these breaches look pretty interesting in the sense that we sometimes feel or think, how could an organization miss something simple like that? So that makes us curious, right? So obviously there is something which is changing in the attacker landscape, in the overall industry landscape. So I would love to ask you this question around that. What are some of these interesting evolutionary aspects that you have noticed in the industry? And with that, we'll segue into this topic of why should we move into something like continuous security validation? Why continuous security validation is important, and of course, what is continuous security validation? So it'll be great to know a little bit of your perspective on the evolution. Why is continuous security validation important, and what is it all about?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the pleasures that I've had living this life is actually living through history. So, starting off, I was an Army officer in the military, and we got to see some of the nasty nation-state attacks very early on during that time period, and that really just evolved over time. And the traditional ways that we would go about things, really it was kind of like Men in Black, where we would get on a plane and we would bring the suitcases, and we get out the forensics tools, and we'd rip out the hard drives, and we try to dig through logs and figure out what happened. And it was a really heavyweight approach, but ultimately the frequency of it and the overall impact and sophistication of it wasn't anywhere near where it is today. And over the past really 10 years, a lot of things have really moved to the cloud. And there's been a lot of automation, a lot of things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, and a lot of these great tools that have been brought to the market that allow us to provide better defense against these types of attacks. The downside to that is those same tools are actually available to criminals as well. And although organizations have gone through their digital transformation over the past 10 years, so is the the hacking community and the criminals at large. And basically what's ended up happening is there's a giant ecosystem. It's a whole underground economy where you have nation state governments working with criminal organizations and vice versa. And it's effectively the criminal organizations become a workforce, and you can actually get in there and you can basically at any given time, you can outsource a criminal activity and you can do ransomware as a service, or you can go after supply chain or access as a service. All these things are at a click of a button for a few fractions of a Bitcoin, or some kind of exchange of finances. So, with that, the number of attacks that have occurred over the years has definitely increased exponentially, and it's almost every year is like the worst year on record for the number of breaches. And really, overall, the regulations across the world haven't been able to keep up. And with that, there's been a lot of investments into the defense behind it. So over the past, I'd say 2-3 years, organizations are becoming more and more serious about security. And a large thing that's kind of pushing that forward are the organizations, unfortunately, that end up being on the front page of the newspaper, and it ends up being a global audience that, XYZ company didn't do ABC tasks, and then ultimately there's serious negative consequences. Typically in the form of direct impact, because there's an impact to the overall impact of their operations, and then being able to deliver services and have it be available, and then overall basically being able to it ends up being a cost that covers many years because of the impact to the brand, and then overall impact to their overall security posture. And that's kind of where the continuous security validation ends up coming in, and has really been driving forward. And it's been leading to different approaches like advancements in vulnerability scanning, in penetration testing, in risk assessments and posture assessments, and ultimately the spectrum of ethical hacking. So getting into kind of the blue team, red team type scenarios. So it's been interesting to see the kind of the industry just grow up.
Yeah. So interestingly, as Brad, as you were mentioning about this, I was thinking about like a couple of decades back during my school days, there used to be this group of hackers, and even though I eventually got into cybersecurity, during those days I was more into the science side. I mean, more into computer science. So I wasn't myself a hacker, but then I was quite I had a group of hacker friends, etc. And I remember that these guys used to continuously look for whenever there is a new vulnerability which gets released, how quickly can you write a patch and then scan the entire university network, because internet during those days was not so much there outside, and then try to compromise systems. So interestingly, what has happened is the same thing today is being done by the nation state actors. They're just looking for that window of small opportunity, and whenever that opportunity is there, they would like to grab it, right? The same is true for ransomware guys. So the adversary is doing this continuously in terms of looking for that one single opportunity for a few minutes or a few hours, as well as the number of changes that's happening is also at that same frequency, right? The release frequency, people do release every day and sometimes even every hour and stuff like that, right? So a very dynamic environment. Attackers have become as agile as the developers and the creators of stuff. Both the breakers and builders have gone very agile, and they're making continuous changes. So that kind of forces us that we must do continuous testing. I mean, obviously, our security validation. And in fact, one interesting thing which I kind of sometimes talk about is, if you look at the breaches which are happening, many of the breaches look very simple. Some looks very complex, like a complex multi-stage attack, etc. But most of the breaches apparently look very simple. And if you look at it, It reminds me of the poem which I read during my childhood days, which is about that for want of a nail, the shoe was lost, horseshoe. And for want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the general was lost. And for want of a general, the battle was lost. So you start with a small nail and then lose the battle.
Hmm.
If you look at many of those breaches, it looks like a small misconfiguration, which led to a very large compromise and things like that. And then there are those 0 days, which are more like nukes, but that's very rare. Very rarely
Right.
organizations get compromised because of 0 days. So continuously making sure that things are clean, that has become the need of the hour. And what you mentioned is something really, really pertinent. So let's dive deeper into the topic of like where do you see the industry is today? So we know the hackers and attackers has become very sophisticated. So where is the industry today? That's say part one, and part two. Let's also look into what's the state of industry in terms of the types of testing available, etc. So both the maturity and also what's in the kit of the defenders.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, and basically, I'll kind of weave in where organizations are today with basically actionable advice as I go along. And the number one piece of advice that I have to organizations is to fully embrace horizontally and vertically throughout your organization, and it goes above and beyond just your own four walls to have the right mindset that you will eventually be breached.
So do you
And
see that mindset? I mean, do you
I
see you
don't.
and you have worked with both the SMBs and the large enterprises? Do you see that mindset today? And
I
that's a very important mindset, like accepting that there will be those breaches. Huh?
I see it more now than I ever have in the past 2 decades, but it's not anywhere near where it needs to
Should be.
be. And unfortunately, the root cause of a lot of what exists today is it's NIMBY. It's not in my backyard. So it's not going to happen to me. It's going to happen to somebody else. And it's not until it's someone that's close to them. So if they're in the industry, let's say they're in retail and their biggest competitor ends up having a major data breach and they're on the front page of the newspaper and they see the major financial impact. It's really only at that point that they actually start to wake up and be a little bit of proactive.
And then again go
Um,
back to sleep. Is that so?
and yeah, and then and then at that point in time. So, and what organizations really understand, it's not a matter of whether or not it's going to happen to you. It's a question of when and how bad. And really, at some point, and whether it's a year, 2 years, 3 years, at some point, organizations will be in a continuous state of a data breach. So you'll not only have to deal with the one data breach, it's going to be continuous. You're going to have to fight those battles on multiple different fronts and maintain multiple at the same time. And that's the level of mindset and mentality and maturity that organizations need to adopt, because this stuff isn't going away. And like pretty much anyone that has access to a keyboard can now just walk right in your front door, just using very simple tactics. It doesn't really require a skill set anymore or heavy coding or expertise to do some of the attacks that exist today. And depending on where they are in the world, I mean, there's really very little repercussions around that, and any kind of punishment that might come forth to mitigate or stop it. Because once you start going over international borders and in that nature, it makes it that much more difficult. So
So
what are we?
where do you
Yeah.
see the frequency of security validation which the industry has adopted right now? Since you have seen a wide array of all these companies, when it comes to the small and medium-sized enterprises as well as large, what's the kind of frequency that you observe right now? How far
Yeah,
are we from continuous? That's the question.
Jesus. It's not close enough is the answer. So really what it comes down to is organizations, like current state of the market right now is organizations are really broken up into kind of 5 different levels of maturity. So it's It's really from 0 all the way up to 5. And with that, organizations that typically are in the continuous security testing space and actually doing it on a continuous basis are the upper level 5 arena, and they typically have the budgets to support it. Ends up being financial and healthcare, and to basically the global 500 that are in that aspect. It's starting to go downstream though, which is great, because I'm starting to see that in the lower levels areas, their organizations are starting to get involved, and then there's a lot of managed detection and response and managed security service providers that are integrating these types of security testings as part of their larger stack. So, and they're automating a large portion of it, which ultimately makes it ideal for it to be 24/7, 365, and implementing things like continuous automated red team or CART, attack surface management, and identifying where the actual attack surface is. There's breach attack emulation solutions out there that can be fully entwined, and then some of the latest and greatest innovative startups and solutions out there are actually allowing you to bring your own malware and then test for these 0 days, because these 0-day attacks are starting to become more and more prevalent. But where the bulk of organizations are from a maturity level, typically it's between the 0 and 3. And I've had conversations with organizations where they really have done nothing in terms of their vulnerability management. There's a lot of legacy systems that are in place, and it's kind of we've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas. And then they don't even know where to start. And the good news is there is a lot of help out there, and there's a lot of organizations that are starting to adopt a hybrid environment. They know that they can't take it on themselves. They're reaching out to professional services. They're leveraging people, process, and technology to basically elevate and level up their organization to get from one level to the next and then move on up. So as these tools and these capabilities and these solutions continue to be more and more readily available, then it's there that the adoption is increasing. And the biggest challenge is there's a lot of tools out there, and it's really hard to evaluate all the hundreds of different solutions. I mean, at Gartner, I was tracking well over 300 vendors just in the threat intel and endpoint security space alone. So a lot of different solutions out there. It's easy to get lost, and there's not a lot of areas where there's consolidation, where you can kind of just have one SKU or one purchase that kind of rules them all. So
yeah, that's interesting, Brad. So I remember you mentioned about ASM, CART, and BAS. So can you give a high level overview of the use cases of these three?
Yeah, absolutely. So it really comes down to breadth and depth, and in terms of your overall focus area. So the kind of the more breadth that you have and the larger area that you have is where attack surface management is. And ultimately, the best way to think about it is you're trying to protect your house. And that's usually an analogy that I end up using, which is you're trying to protect your home, so you've got to lock all the doors and all the windows, but there might be a weak point. There might be a door that's just it doesn't have the best lock on it. And that's typically how organizations end up getting in. They typically expose what I call the human element. So they'll get in through phishing or social engineering. They'll convince knock on the door and try to figure out a way to get into your organization. And it's really just it's typically an outside in view. It's like, if I was an attacker, how would I break into this house? How would I break into your infrastructure? And it helps identify those weak points so you can address it. And sometimes it ends up being areas where it might be on email security because of phishing or social engineering. It might be just security awareness training and leveling up your people in terms of being aware of these types of scenarios. And then it might be basically identifying each areas that you could dive into. So looking at different vulnerabilities. So we talked about 0 days and identifying and making sure that you keep up with the patching and maintaining the latest and greatest updates on all of your devices, and also knowing where those devices are. So a lot of times what ends up happening, when I covered ransomware specifically, as well as endpoint security and to a lesser extent on kind of the Internet of Things or IoT side, a lot of organizations just, it was over 50% of organizations didn't know the devices that they had in their environment. And if you don't know that it's there, and you don't know that there's a door or a device that's on your network that has access to your to effectively to your crown jewels and the critical assets that you're trying to protect, then you're completely in the blind. You're in the dark. So that's like the best easy way to identify the areas where you need to improve, and then around that you can actually take action. So you can actually implement and patch those systems, and you can identify and prioritize that effectively, and actually build that into your risk program. Now on
So this is more about ASM, right? The ASM providing the breadth of your infrastructure, and now Gartner is also calling it EASM, External Attack Surface Management, which gives you the full view of your complete digital attack surface or external attack surface. So that's 100%. The breadth part, right? Yes.
Yeah, 100%. And then there's obviously a lot of use cases that go into that. It's a pretty simple example, but it also impacts like your neighbor's house. So basically, if your neighbor is getting hacked into or broken into, that obviously that's information that's really important to you. So and that's the equivalent of supply chain and supply chain attacks and risk and that nature. Or it might be an acquisition. So you're looking to buy your neighbor's house or someone down the road if they've been broken into or they've had some kind of incident in the past. That obviously increases their risk profile. So what do you do about that? And then God forbid if someone actually does break into your house and steals information, the equivalent of data leakage, what do they actually steal? And then how do they get in? And then having all that information work with your overall security operations center and the kind of the overall security analytics and monitoring that you have, and effectively threat intelligence, which works across all of these different systems, you get a really good picture of what is happening, opposed to just being in the dark with no flashlight, not really knowing what's going on, not knowing what devices are in your network that you actually need to protect, and being able to do that. And as you can see, historically, organizations would only do this in a single point of time, typically on like an annual basis. If you had the budgets, semi-annual basis, where you'd have consultants come in and do a very focused in pen test, which is more in depth. It'll be a specific scope in terms of being able to understand and assess your risk, your posture assessment and your risk assessment area. Now, pivoting to more of the kind of the inside area and getting more hands-on, there's certainly been a large increase in the adoption of breach attack simulation and what a new advent of this space called breach attack emulation. And with the difference, you're primarily being having a simulated area where it's a mock training exercise, and it's not exactly realistic versus actually having an advanced persistent threat group that's emulated, and it's a very realistic area where you can actually implement your own malware. You can have 0-day attacks and actually train your workforce on a continuous basis to basically combat these types of attacks. So you're basically simulating an actual thief that's trying to break into your home. So, and then in terms of like the red team aspect, another scenario, it's much more deeper. So attack surface management, it's got the breadth, and then with BAS and BAE, you are getting more and more deeper. And then with red team, you're really narrow focused, and you're really going after very specific use cases. So we want to know, how susceptible is our server environment, and all the vulnerabilities that are there, and in all the different ways that organizations could get in through that methodology. And with that, historically, it ended up being an engagement where organizations would come in, typically on an annual, semi-annual basis, and they would actually have, effectively a red team exercise, and it'd be slightly different than a pen test and more focused, where you don't really know what they're going to do. It's specifically geared towards that use case. And what's ended up happening is organizations will, a lot of security vendors are starting to break into the space and have come up with some really creative approaches to this, where they're actually able to automate it and do it on a continuous basis. So we more formally known as continuous automation and automated red teams, or CART. So hopefully that provides a little bit more insights into kind of what's happening there and the different options. And then there's obviously solutions in between there, but
Great.
yes.
So basically, if I kind of try to summarize what you mentioned, so there is this vector of breadth versus depth, and then there is this external versus internal, right? So
Absolutely.
So ASM offers that breadth from outside in. BAS gives you the internal view, and red teaming can give you the depth, but a narrow focus depth, but that's more point in time, but CART is making it more automated,
Yes.
right? So so that's how, if we kind of create a 2x2 matrix, I mean, then you can place all these various things into that. So that's very interesting, Brad. So let's get into the next part, which is around, like, if an organization has to or wants to build a capability around continuous security validation, how should they build a program? What should be the kind of high-level program structure? What are the critical capabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. So it starts with the mindset. So it's not an event. It's not like a company offset, company offsite situation where you're going to get everybody together, you're going to get on the whiteboard and jump in there. It's a process. It's a continuous process. It's a continuous thing that your organization needs to do all the time, and it needs to hit every single organization, both vertically and horizontally. And the best way to do it, and what I've recommended over the years, is taking the approach of crawl, walk, run. So start small and identify what your current state is. Figure out and baseline where you are from a security posture perspective. And there's tons of organizations out there that can do these assessments. There's tons of templates and things out there that, at giving your organization, you should be, you're currently at a level 1 or level 2, and your goal should be to get to the next level, whether it's 2 or 3. And identifying all those areas and how you can make that, you can step from one area to the next. And then from there, ultimately, kind of the key areas that organizations end up not prioritizing effectively and can really increase their security posture is ultimately reducing that attack surface. So if there's less area for the attackers to go after, it makes it significantly difficult for them, and they'll actually move on to a more weaker target. And as more and more organizations do that.
So Brad, let me just pause for a while over here, because you mentioned something which is very, very interesting. That is reduction of attack surface, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I was talking with one of the very well-known security expert, and he just moved from one of the organizations to another. So I was just talking to him around what are some of your top focus areas. So he mentioned I have like 6-7 focus areas, and one of the topmost area was reduction of attack surface. Now,
Mhm.
I understand like this sounds very simple, but it is
Yes.
very hard to do, right? If you are talking about digital attack surface, maybe some of these tools, etc., can help. But then the attack surface is of various types. I mean, if you are building a connected car, there is attack surface of the car. There is attack surface for every subsystem, like an onion, right? So
Oh yeah.
attack surface is not like just a single surface. So it's a very complex problem, and I believe there's probably no single solution, no silver bullet to reduce that. But I wanted to just um, touch upon this point. Are there some thoughts, strategies, tactics which you suggest which organizations could adopt to reduce their attack surface? And then again, we'll come back. I know we had been talking about the other topic, so I wanted to just go a little bit deeper on the attack surface reduction.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately it comes down to what is your current state. So so a lot of organizations, one of the top pitfalls is they try to bite off too much at once, and they just try to sprint. They just go right into Olympic level sprinting, when like just crawl, identify the areas that are the most critical to you. And I'll pick an example here: multi-factor authentication. So anyone that, yeah, on the front page of the newspaper, you'll see organizations that or you'll see that criminals are having these data breaches, and they're stealing all these records. These records end up being username and password. And um, and what's ended up happening is with access as a service is criminals are able to just, their main entry point is credential stuffing, and they can use automated tools to just go after an organization, and then they just keep trying different combinations until they find an access to someone, and then they get in, they move laterally and get to an administrator. So an organization can reduce their attack surface significantly just by having multi-factor authentication, and it adds that extra layer of security in their environment. And then there's other areas that are there, but that's the biggest area. The other area is security training overall, just making people aware. It's a mindset. It's a culture, and identifying, if I see a phishing email, I need to report it, and having a process around that, and then building it over time. So maybe doing a simulated phishing exercise that turns into a ransomware exercise. So in the and just running that for a couple hours um, a day for a month, or whatever period. And kind of like a good example that I've come up over the years is getting a kind of like an elementary school or grade school. A grade school getting a bunch of children ready for a fire drill. So if you remember when you're younger and going through that, the fire alarm goes off, and then everybody kind of freaks out and they don't know what to do. And then basically as you go through these rehearsals, you identify, okay, well, when the alarm goes off, we get single file, we go outside, and then we make sure everyone's safe and out of the building, and we make sure everything's right. And then once the firemen come, then it's safe to get back in. And that you got to kind of treat it like that. And effectively it is a fire in your organization. And doing these fire drills and doing these practices, doing tabletop exercises, and identifying, okay, what is the route that we're going to go, and taking that and putting it on the wall, putting it in the break room. In the event that there is a ransomware attack, unplug your computer, report it to security immediately, and then having the actual templates for how you're going to communicate that internally and externally, and having each of those different phases. And then the continuous aspect of this is making it better over time. So it basically, when I was a functional manager, one of the key things that I always tell my employees is improve every day. If you can have just those micro little actions, over a period of time, you'll actually start moving up the security maturity levels, and going from a 1 to a 2, a 2 to a 3, so on and so forth, by looking at those different weak points. And where attack surface management comes in is it helps you identify those weak points, and then it helps you really prioritizing it and having an actual, like, turning it into an action plan. So you have your current state, and then collectively, you and your stakeholders that you have in your company, you have a desired state, and then in the middle is kind of that crawl, walk, run, and that project plan that gets you there. And that's what works the best. And I've worked with hundreds, maybe thousands of organizations over the years that, and this is the very simple approach that works really well. And you can't just throw a bunch of technology at it. It has to be a mix of people, process, and technology. There has to be governance around it. You have to have modernized technology to help, especially on the automation side, to make it continuous. And then actually having people have the skill set, and then being able to level up those organizations, those resources to be effective in their job and their role.
Yeah, that's a great point. Crawl, walk, run, and that's probably the only way to run.
Yeah, well, we're gonna get there.
Yeah, so let me bring up this more in the context of the small and medium-sized businesses. So for them, who doesn't have access to all these latest and greatest ASM and CART tools, etc., and may not have that number of people to run those. So what do you think? How should SMB approach when it comes to continuous security validation? Because today the attackers are targeting the SMB more or less in the same manner as anybody else, because on the internet for a ransomware guy is the same IP.
Yep.
So they just target every single IP address across the globe, right? So how do you think SMB should approach building a continuous security validation program?
Yeah, and my advice is same process, but think smarter, not harder. So, and really what it comes down to is it comes right back to the attack surface, but it's really being strict around, and being open and saying, do we really need this? So good aspect to it is, you talked about the attack surface getting into areas where now we have IoT and endpoints and more things that are interconnected with the cloud and more exposed. It's no longer just a network perimeter, especially in these smaller organizations. They have all these endpoints and all these different aspects, and having their environment be hardened, and then implementing network segmentation and breaking off those components. So like a good example, going back to the house analogy, if someone breaks into my house and I lock each individual door within my house, which is the equivalent of having segmentation, it actually, it kind of hardens the internal aspect once they actually break in. So the overall impact that exists is greatly reduced, and that's really the fundamentals around the attack surface management component. So if it, and I kind of, the advice I've given organizations is like, if it doesn't need to be in your environment, then don't have it be in your environment. So if you don't need organizations to access, to basically not have any kind of like URL filtering or having any kind of like block websites, like you shouldn't be able to go to whatever website that you want if you're working in a corporate environment on a corporate machine. And that's a very common mistake that organizations have. They don't have any policies around what people can access and can't access. And in some work environments, it's not appropriate and doesn't make sense from a security perspective to have access to social media, or being able to have users, typical regular users, have administrative access so they can download whatever programs that they want. And I can think of over 100 examples where that was commonplace, and organizations have come to me and asked me, is it a best practice to not have the end user have access to administrative rights? And it's like, well, yeah, absolutely, and that's an easy fix. It doesn't cost anything to do that. It's not a bona fide business need to have them have it, and it greatly reduces your security risk. And once you start adding in things like multi-factor authentication, stricter password rules, and then password resets, having the segmentation aspect where you're locking each individual door, and then basically constantly checking and going in and doing these monitoring aspects and having these different exercises with red teams and having more of the in-depth on specific use cases. So like this month, we're going to go in and just validate that we can respond to a phishing attack or a ransomware attack or someone taking advantage of a vulnerability in our server architecture. And then and there's a lot of open source software out there too. There's pros and cons to that. But there are a lot of tools out there, and a lot of organizations are actually moving towards a product-led growth type approach where they actually have a freemium level version of their product. So those are definitely things that they should absolutely take advantage of, where there's tons of tools out there that they can get exposure to and get access to that they can have exposure to, especially if they're tight on budgets. The other thing too is to prioritize consolidated solutions. So with the advent of endpoint protection platforms and extended detection and response, or XDR, and a lot of the MDR, managed detection response, and managed services out there, I would certainly prioritize kind of an all-in-one type approach where you can get, it's not necessarily the best of breed in all the different categories, but you can identify certain areas that are the most important to you and being able to implement that and kind of you get the biggest return on your investment. And then over time, then you can start weaving in best of breed solutions as you get more budget, you get more mature, and you kind of move up that security maturity levels.
Yeah. So Brad, you made a few great points, which I believe is very, very helpful for these small and medium-sized businesses. One point you mentioned was that you can start crawling with open source tools, right? Of course,
Yes.
open source tools has its pros and cons, but if you have somebody who got some bandwidth, that's a great way to start, right? So that's a great start for sure. And there are a lot of such open source tools out there. And another second very interesting strategy, which you mentioned, broad level strategy, is finding those solutions which has got multiple things together rather than going for a single specialized thing. Look for Swiss Army knives kind of stuff, right?
Yes,
So which has
exactly.
got multiple things together. So those are some really, really great points. And let's move to the next part, which is you have seen all of these organizations which has matured over period of time, and you have seen across various breadth of the industry. So what had been some of the key things which you noticed as the common success factors as well as common mistakes? So some of the common success factors and failure factors when it comes to implementing continuous security validation.
Yeah, very good point. And I'll kind of preface this by saying the answer is unique to every single organization. So it heavily depends on the nature of the business, the culture, unfortunately budgets, and having that strategic alignment between the overall organization's financial goals and their security goals. And as part of that, ultimately you want to have you want to prevent attacks from happening in the first place. And there are metrics and key metrics that you can identify where you're able to reduce those attempts in the first place. So the equivalent of this would be like, let's just say at 2 o'clock in the morning, you hear someone knocking on your door, between the hours of 2 and 3 a.m. And, although they're not getting in, that's the equivalent of reconnaissance. And they're basically trying to probe and identify areas that you're in. And those might be, something as simple as firewall deny logs that might be of interest. And then so on and so forth. So anything you can do to identify those areas and eliminate them or reduce them is a key metric that you want to have. The other thing is, like, in the event that you actually have an incident, you want to reduce or that you have a breach or someone's in your organization. The number one thing is to detect them as soon as possible. and overall reducing what's called the dwell time, and the amount of time that attacker is in your house effectively. And you want to basically investigate it as quickly as possible. You want to eradicate it as quickly as possible, and you want to address what the core entry point was in the first place, and then basically patch it up, fix it so it doesn't happen again. And those are key fundamentals that are there. And that's where the biggest challenge is like organizations just don't have they don't have the visibility that they require to get to those points. Those are certainly very key. The other kind of key point that organizations will get into is a lot of the monitoring and doing these different assessments is ultimately they're trying to find a needle in a haystack is a common analogy that's used. And unfortunately, what organizations will do, especially early on, is they'll add more and more hay with the idea that they will have better visibility. And unfortunately, that actually makes things more difficult because it's more difficult to actually find the needle. So as a key metric and focus and priority area, it's definitely best practice to eliminate the noise and eliminate all that excess hay, so you can find these needles faster and quicker, and eventually get to the point where you're actually able to categorize the individual needles, so you can actually identify a needle within a stack of needles that's relevant to the specific use case that you have. Because what will happen with advanced persistent threats is they'll actually come back time and time again. And unfortunately, one of the key things that ends up happening is, especially with ransomware attacks, is organizations they'll actually recover and implement a backup, or basically get to a steady state, but they won't address the main entry point that the attackers use to get in. So all they do is they come right back in, and that's why paying for ransomware doesn't really work, because a lot of times organizations don't address the core entry point. And once kind of the word gets out, then it's open season. So you might have multiple different criminal organizations looking to get into your environment. And there's metrics that you can build around all of those things, like reducing false positives, reducing false negatives, and then and overall measuring it is very critical, because that's how you ultimately improve it.
That's great. So I remember we were talking about magic, and you had been a magician in
Yes.
your younger days. Do you still pursue magic, Brad?
I occasionally, yes, I'll break out a deck of cards at an event or whatever, and I'll play my mind tricks on people, and I try and identify the weakest link in the audience that I can prey upon. But yeah. So yeah, I did. It's kind of always been it's always been a passion of mine, that the allure and the illusions that come with magic, and ultimately, like, I love hearing people laugh and just overall just enjoying life. And so over the years, I've certainly done that, and a lot of it is like, it's very similar to what I do today in cybersecurity. So when you're actually putting on a magic show, or you're doing that, first off, you don't really know what you're doing when you start, and it starts by making that decision, have that mindset, I'm going to be a magician, or I'm going to just do a magic trick, and be really good at that one thing, and then move to the second thing, and then it's that whole crawl, walk, and run thing, and approach. And within different security attacks, it starts with reconnaissance, the knocking on the door at 2 o'clock in the morning kind of scenario, where they're probing that. As a magician, you want to identify the right people in the audience that you could, effectively put those mind tricks on, and kind of show the magic, because it's all about magic. It's all about deception and illusions, and then you kind of get into the weaponization aspect of it, where you're asking them to pick something out of your hand, and ultimately the payload comes where it just disappears and they're completely baffled about what happened. So it's really not that far off from what criminals are effectively doing in the cybersecurity space. And so anyways, it's funny that you bring that up.
So you kind of stole my words. So in a way, this is very much like magic. So I recall when we were chatting earlier, you mentioned about magic. Magic is also, I'm quite passionate about it. I used to do shows at one point in time.
Yes.
Now I don't. I had been kind of out of touch, but I'm still curious. So one interesting thing about magic is if you could place a lot of eyes from all possible directions around the magician, and if you could continuously keep an eye, then the magician can't fool you. If you can look at the magician from 360 degrees, and look at all the places simultaneously. And I think in a way, we are facing a similar challenge, right? Our problem is just like in the case of magic, we have only one pair of eyes, so we focus on one thing, magician does something else, right? So if we have to really not get fooled, we need this continuous visibility. We need this continuous visibility of both breadth and depth, and especially breadth, because that's where hackers will initially break in from, right?
Exactly.
So in the kind of similar spirit of magic, you need to build kind of capabilities for continuous security validation as a program. So before we close, Brad, let me just ask you something a little bit outside of the topic. So outside of magic, what are some of your passion, and also what are some of the interesting books or podcast and anything that you find exciting which you would love to share with others?
Yeah, absolutely. So my passion is helping others. That's why I was put on this earth. Everything I do is to help others, and it's ubiquitous to everything that I do. And anyone that's ever worked with me in the past or knows me very well, they know it. I'm always available 24/7, 365, and I'm a big believer in karma because things always come back tenfold. And I'm very blessed to be where I am, and all of that. So in terms of just overall literature that I think is critical, really comes down, I mean, one of my favorite authors is Stephen Covey. He's the one that wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I really live those values day in, day out. I mean, I would say that, confidently that book saved my life. Just because of where I am and the different lives that I've touched over the years. And one of the seventh habit is sharpening the saw, and it's all about continuous improvement and just being able to actually cut through a piece of wood or whatever task you're doing with that saw is symbolic of continuous improvement and kind of everything that we've been talking about here, which is continuously improving, crawl, walk, run, and just getting better and improving every single day. And it's those micro actions that's going to get you to where you need to go over time. And unfortunately, the key pitfall that a lot of organizations get into is they turn it into a large project, and then it's like looking up at Mount Everest. It's like, how am I ever gonna get up this mountain? And anyone that's ever climbed climbed Everest will tell you, starts with the first step, step after step after step, and then going for one hill to the next after the next, and then before you know it, you're at the summit. And that's how you do it. That's how you continuously improve, and you increase your security posture and really get to a better state.
That's wonderful, Brad. And I think that's a great way to end our conversation. Thank you so much for being part of the community and for joining us. Thank you so much, Brad.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks.